Good evening and welcome to another edition of Rants and Raves, the video version of my blog, Rants and Raves, which is to be found at stephenwbrown.com. That's Stephen with a PH and Brown with an E. Tonight's episode is called, what is this thing called democracy? Democracy, as H.L. Mencken said, the theory that the people know what they want and deserve to get it good and hard. Okay, well, what is this thing? Well, there are two roots in the Greek language, the ancient Greek. Demos, the people, so democracy is commonly taught as the rule of the people. But there's another word, the deme, which is a city ward or a voting district, like that. By the way, in anthropology, your humble servant has a master's degree in the subject. A deme is a local breeding group, the lowest level on which evolution occurs. Thought you'd like to know that. Okay, well, democracy. Alexis de Tocqueville wrote 2 volumes on the subject, and went very deeply into the subject. So, well, fortunately, your humble narrator has a gift for extemporaneous summarizing. So, what is this thing? And who am I to talk about it? Well, as it happens, I've been on the scene and have seen a couple of new democracies in places like Poland and Bulgaria. Poland, after it had been getting off the ground for about a year, and Bulgaria as it was getting off the ground. And I've seen countries which didn't have any of it. So, also, I should mention that of course there is this constant thing you hear about, we're a republic, not a democracy. Well, when you consider that notion of the deme, the voting district, and representatives chosen from those, the definition gets a little fuzzy around the edges. But generally speaking, we know what we're talking about. We're talking about a government in which the people have some kind of input, a fair degree of input that distinguishes it from an oligarchy or a tyranny. That definition is also a little fuzzy because all complex societies are oligarchies. All complex societies have a few people who specialize in law and governing because most people simply aren't interested in it. I mean, it's hard enough getting people to vote. Notice that in the last election, though hotly contested, 46% of the people didn't. Okay, well, Churchill called democracy the worst form of government except for all the others. The definition I like was given by an English novelist named Gavin Lyle, who said, I think democracy is a habit. A habit of regular turnover of offices, regular elections. Do we want to keep this guy or not? A habit, consistency. Because as Friedrich von Hayek noted one time, in matters of law and politics, beyond a certain minimum, it is more important that the law be consistent than it be perfectly just, whatever that is, or make perfect sense, because we have to know what to expect from day to day. I've touched on this before. Well, de Tocqueville was better than I at explaining this thing, and it is said that de Tocqueville had this American moment in which I think he saw democracy on its lowest level in its rawest form at a New England town meeting. He saw people, bickering over this and that with their petty concerns, and of course the usual collection of loudmouths the town loudmouth who has to have his say, whether he has anything to say or not. Believe me, I've seen this, covering city council meetings and county commissions and such, as a journalist. They say that de Tocqueville went back to his rooming house and wrote a journal entry full of Gallic scorn for these American rubes. Went to bed and, in the middle of the night, woke up, sat bolt upright, and said, Mon Dieu, they are governing themselves. That's the notion that we govern ourselves. And that's a pretty radical notion. I mean, it only shows up in history about 2,000 years ago, in a couple of places, like in Athens, in Greece, where they invented the word. And if you look in 1 Samuel of the Old Testament, in ancient Israel. And the Israelis gave up on the idea. The the Israelites, I should say, of that time gave up on the idea. They found it burdensome. They wanted a king, and Samuel noted that God was highly pissed at them. So, you say, based on what I've seen, what are some of the characteristics of democracy? Well, I mentioned regular elections, of course. Who gets to vote in them? Well, that has changed and expanded over the years. Of course, it used to be only free males of a certain standing with a certain, very often with a certain amount of property, as happened in Athens, and it happened in early America also, which relates to what I will call the skin in the game theory of democracy, which I'll get to at the end of this piece. Okay. The thing that I've noticed about democracy from observing the scene in places like South America, where they keep trying and don't ever seem to get it quite right, with a few exceptions, is continuity, regularity and continuity. You can't suspend your democracy. I mean, if you do, you don't pick it up where you left off, that in a very real sense you have to start over from the beginning, building a new tradition of regular elections. Note that in the United States we have never suspended an election. Oh, plenty of them have been dodgy, but even during the Civil War, the most massive conflict in our history, in which we were killing each other at a rate that all our other wars combined have yet to equal, we did not suspend the elections. The first election during the war, Lincoln versus McClellan, all the evidence suggests that until the victory at Gettysburg, I believe, that Lincoln expected to lose to a poltroon he had sacked for incompetence, and all evidence again suggests that he intended to turn the presidency over to him. Oh, you can't suspend it. The second thing I noticed while I was living in Eastern Europe during the time of the new democracies over there, Poland is on its third republic, which is, by the way, still better than France, which is on its fifth, that it's not the first election that determines whether you've got a functioning democracy or not. It's the first election in which the party that's in power loses, and with some degree of grace turns it over. This happened in Eastern Europe when, after the first flush of freedom, reformed communists or ex-communists were returned to power in honest elections, because they found out something. It's not enough to have good intentions. You have to know how to work the lever of power, the levers of power. Another thing, I can't claim credit for this. Thomas Jefferson noticed this when he said, "Great innovations should not be forced on slender majorities." Jefferson said that the will of the majority is in all things to prevail, but it should be rightful. And then he noticed that thing about slender majorities. I will note some things that were passed on very slender majorities, like Obamacare and such like that, have been causing quite a lot of trouble. There are people that say it's working great, and there are people say, no, it's not working great for me. By the way, I'm one of them. It's not working great for me at all. I do know people whom it does seem to be working great for. Obviously, there are winners and losers here. And again, this was a slender majority. Anything that is passed on a majority that slender is probably not a good idea. Even if you think it is a good idea, you might want to wait until you've convinced more people, because majorities as slender as 3%, 4%, that's the number of people who change their minds 3 times before breakfast. All right. The other thing is about democracy, another thing, you can't make everybody happy. We know that. What a democracy sometimes has to strive for is an equality of dissatisfaction. You can't make everybody happy, but you can make everybody about equally unhappy. if everybody's about equally, is grumbling to about the same level, things will skate along on an even keel, and you can hear the grumble, grumble, grumble. When you hear grumble, grumble, grumble over here and over here, problems. Another thing democracy has to have, and this is what Athens didn't, is a cultural meme that we have come to call the rights of man. And that's an interesting concept, and it's something we took a long time coming up with. And if you try to back off and look at it objectively, because everybody talks about their rights these days, what is it? What is a right? A right is an obligation the entire human race has towards you. The obligation to leave you alone in all things that do not concern them. I.e., that there are parts of your life, there are things which are sacrosanct and apart from the concern of your neighbors, apart from the concern of the state. Something that are between you and yourself, or you and God, if you happen to be religious. Oh. Going back to that point about Jefferson and the majority is to prevail, but the majority must be rightful in order to prevail. Okay, democracy, like Churchill said, is a very bad form of government, the worst except for all the others. So what are some of the weaknesses of democracy? Well, one, and this is something we are only starting to find out and don't really want to talk about, so I'm going to bring it up anyway. Democracy doesn't do diversity very well. Note that in places like early Athens or the early American colonies and the very young United States, what was the point of limiting the franchise, of limiting the right to vote? It ensured that the right to vote was, that the people who were voting constituted a relatively homogeneous group. Things started to come apart when that group got very heterogeneous, i.e., Yankee merchants, Southern slaveholders. The fact is, diversity is done better by empires, and this is not necessarily a bad thing. You have empires also. There are better and worse empires. The British Empire, on balance, not so bad, with some really, really egregious exceptions to that. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, also, likewise, a diversity of peoples ruled by a central authority. Now, the thing is that you could join the ruling class. The interesting thing about the Austro-Hungarian Empire, for anybody who knows about the Polish partition, the third of Poland that was in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was the number of Poles who put von before their name. Hemingway's lost great love was Agnieszka von Kurowska. You could join if you accepted the values and standards of the ruling class. The other thing, democracies are subject to great waves of passion. Athens voted on one occasion to commit genocide on an enemy, on another city-state, sent a ship to carry the word, kill them all, thought better of it, and the very next day voted against it, and sent another ship that sailed into the harbor just as the first ship was delivering their message. On another occasion, on the island of Melos, they did vote to massacre every male inhabitant over the age of 10. They were seriously pissed at them. The Melosians wanted to remain neutral in the Peloponnesian War. The Athenians told them, the strong do what they will, the weak suffer what they must. And who is the weakest? The minority. Whether the minority is poor and downtrodden or rich, they're still minorities. That's the problem with democracy, and that's, again, why we have the notion of rights, to moderate the will of the majority. I might also point out in that context that something all enthusiastic for democracy should remember Hitler came to power in an honest election. There were, of course, no elections after that. The other thing is inconsistency. Our own country, our foreign policy is worryingly inconsistent to our allies because we had a period of time in which we believed that our internal dissensions ended at the shore. Well, now we're too much involved in other people's affairs, and they don't end at the shore. We have swings of policy. Note the example that's being brooded about recently is the Iraq War, which, by the way, indicates if you're going to do imperialism, you need to do it right or not do it at all. The United States, yes, with some help from its allies, conquered a very vile and brutal dictatorship and settled things down. There was an insurgency, there was the surge against the insurgency, and things seemed to be going well, and then on the next administration, the Obama administration, they decided to pull out. Iraq is now a mess. It would have been better, perhaps, not to have done it at all and simply lived with the fact that there was a brutal dictator in that region than, again, doing it wrong, doing it inconsistently. We have mechanical problems in democracy, mainly voter fraud. Now, which brings us to the dangers of democracy and the current crisis. A lot of people believe that there was voter fraud. Yeah, there's a number of people who believe that it's very possible that Trump didn't lose the popular vote, that the popular vote that favored Hillary was almost exclusively in two areas, Southern California and New York. There are people that believe that massive numbers of illegal aliens voted in the election in California, which carries a huge number of electoral votes. Of course, there are people on the left who believe that there is massive voter suppression. Now, I personally think that the first possibility, voter fraud, is at least possible. I believe the second is absurd. The logistics of voter fraud, of intimidating that many voters without it being glaringly obvious, again, it seems breathtakingly absurd to me. Nonetheless, both concerns have to be addressed, and I do hope that our next president, who takes office in a few days, will address both of them. We have to know one way or the other. Was there massive illegal voter fraud in California? Was there any kind of voter intimidation? And how would you establish it? And both sides need to make clear what they would accept as proof of this. A proof that it either did not happen, or if it did, that the problem is being addressed. It's claimed on the right that Obama encouraged illegals to vote. I've seen that video. Not exactly yes, but not exactly no either. What he did was he stated that the records are not cross-checked, that there would be no consequences of doing so. That's not exactly encouraging illegals to vote, but it is sort of telling them that, yeah, you might try that. Okay. This brings me to my final point about the will of the majority. The will of the majority and the idea of rights. This is what I call the skin in the game principle. Is that if democracy is going to function, we should be voting on only those things which concern the people who are voting. This came up, a Facebook argument with a friend who believes that the free market naturally tends towards oligopolies. And I say, okay, show me proof. It's the kind of person that believes that the people should vote on things like hiring decisions in your business. What I want to know is, what consequences do you incur by being wrong? Do you have skin in the game? There it is. What makes, are you allowed to vote on whether I spank my children or not? Are you allowed to vote on what my family budget is going to be? Okay. Well, most people, I think, would say, well, there are people who would say something about the first. About my family budget, what I have for dinner, what I serve my children. What business of yours is it? I mean, in other words, what consequences do you incur if it's a bad decision? Are you going to pay my bills? Now, the question as to who has skin in the game, like there are people that say, well, if you educate your children to believe absurd things like, take your pick, the earth is flat, something like that, well, then society suffers the consequences. Well, okay, we're going to have to argue about that, I do believe. I believe that there are things that families do to raising their children that are probably harmful, but to stretch that out and say, well, all of society suffers, yeah, society suffers, probably suffers from massive ignorance, but again, what consequences can you point to? Can you point to a loss? Can you point to how it affects your bank account, how it affects your children, something like that? That is a whole can of worms we're going to have to argue about. But remember, do you have skin in the game? If you're going to vote on anything that affects me, how does it affect you? I want you to think about that for a bit. Thank you, and good night.